This next story has been suppressed by mainstream media. Let's go to Andreas for more.
Everybody, tune in to Recent Tartarians!
Recent Tartarians! Recent Tartarians!
Hello. Welcome to the Xirtus. Tune in for another exciting episode of wonder, imagination, and discovery.
Recent Tartarians!
Она образует всеобщие закономерности, определяющие законы классической физики для нашего
Sometimes I
мира.
look at the moon and just think, the spin's beautiful.
Baby, when I met you, there was peace unknown.
Что касается энергии наномер, то она превышает ядерную в немыслимое число раз. 10 в 74 степени.
That's it. That's it. That's it. With your arms now. That's it. That's it.
Thank you for watching Xirtus. Keep listening. Remember, if you enjoyed the video, please follow and subscribe and share and support. It really helps. Coming up next, Xirtus.
By the way, that's gone. If you didn't record that, that's gone forever. It's gone.
Yes, I'm back with Gennady. How you doing, buddy? Good to see you again.
Well, good to see you as well, Andreas. Hopefully you're enjoying your time in Europe. Here in the United States, it has been a mess, to say the least. And
yeah, that's about right.
This is what we are here to discuss in part, but the past several weeks have definitely been quite troubling in my view.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you say that, because I think people don't necessarily know your political views necessarily, which is ironic, I think, in a sense, because you are the chair of a political party. So you do obviously have political views, but you've always come across to me as being very open-minded, very flexible about politics, and kind of flexible generally in terms of what ideas you're interested in, generally different kinds of ideas. I see people that are very much on the left or on the right side that ascribe to the USTP, your party. So it's interesting to wonder about what really commonality we share, and especially all the different kinds of people that are interested in, living to the maximal extent of what the human potential is possible. And I think a big part of it, I've been grounded by, outside of the abstracts or the potential for what we could become, is really just your openness to having conversations, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And I appreciate you pointing this out because, of course, in the transhumanist movement and in the US Transhumanist Party, we are truly orthogonal to the conventional political spectrum. So we're neither left-wing nor right-wing, we are up-wing. So we try to promote the policies, the approaches that could elevate the human condition for as many people as possible. And this does mean discussing ideas. It does mean being open to ideas, not rejecting them just because they come from a source that may be conventionally on the right or conventionally on the left. And it means keeping those channels of communication open, channels for discussion, for debate. That is why I come on to so many shows, and sometimes anti-transhumanists will invite me onto their shows, and I will have a debate with them. More importantly, I will have a conversation with them. I will actually try to understand their views and where they're coming from. And I'm not going to condemn them for their views. I'm going to try to engage their positions and see perhaps where do they understand transhumanism accurately? Where do they err? How might their concerns actually be mitigated by what we truly stand for, not what some people might think we stand for? And see if there's some path forward, or at least some way to convince a third-party audience, some observers who have yet to make up their minds what the truth is in a given situation. So I very much consider it essential to preserve that space for free and open discourse, even and especially if people disagree.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. Some of the conversation that you and I have had over the years, right? It's really hard. I've noticed this from comments in the audience. It's really hard to pinpoint either of our positions on a left or right. And as you say, it's really a up and down kind of, are we moving forward conversation. But some people will accuse us of being Marxist because we'll talk about Marxist theories as if we've read them and know what they're about. And other people will accuse us of being extremely right wing because we talk about criticisms of some of these ideological pursuits that don't jive with practical expression of freedom for the individual. And it's amazing to see, if you just pick one argument against one person, whether or not you think of them as, identity politics aligned with this individualist group or this collectivist group. But really, every single conversation we've had has shown a deep deep preference for understanding different ideas and the heterodoxy of ideas from all different groups that would normally hate each other. I feel like this is the kind of goal here, is to take these ideas that are really precious and unique to each one of these groups that think of themselves as so dynamic or oppositional to these other things, and seeing how we can have a more holistic view. I think that's the beautiful goal that we're maybe not just looking for, but actually achieving because of these conversations.
Yes, indeed. And I do wish more people had that approach and that outlook, because American politics and American discourse would have been much better off for it. Essentially, we need to create more spaces for discourse where people genuinely try to understand one another, and where it's a fairly low penalty environment for expressing ideas. So sometimes people might say things that I would consider highly objectionable, even odious, but I don't think they should be fired for it. I don't think they should lose their livelihoods for it, because ideas are not static. A single idea, a single position does not define an individual, and that person may change their mind. And also the Overton window of the acceptability of ideas will shift over time. So a position that is mainstream, or at least tolerated in one era, might no longer be tolerated in another era. Does that mean we discard everything that person had to say or that person had to contribute? For instance, someone like Winston Churchill, by the standards of today's era, was an absolute racist.
Totally cancelable, right? Yeah.
Yes. And yet, if people tried to cancel Winston Churchill today, I hope the majority of the audience would understand how that would be highly problematic. I mean, the man helped to win World War II, and what's more, he was exceptionally learned in history, in international relations. He was a quite talented painter too, self-taught. And to cancel a person like that, and of course to cancel the vast majority of historical figures who ever existed, would so greatly impoverish our civilization that we would have very little left. And then the next generations might very well cancel us. Perhaps we might be canceled if we're meat eaters, because in a generation or two, I think it will become quite commonplace to eat lab-grown meat in place of meat derived from animals. So just because somebody, I would say most people alive today, has ever eaten something derived from an animal, it might be in 50 years, some activists will say we should be canceled. And I don't agree with that.
This is the ex post facto argument that's constitutional. Do you punish people for laws that didn't exist yet? And I notice this is a major part of what we've experienced over the last 20 years. People retrofit their prejudices against those who they aren't perfect, right? I mean, you could say the same thing, like you said, about any person in history. Genghis Khan, probably great for trade routes, pretty much considered a misogynist today. You know, any example would be the same, that humans are not perfect. And if you were to try to find a reason not to listen to someone, you could do that about everyone, because every person is flawed. There are except for maybe the mythological figures or Jesus Christ, everyone has got sides to them. And even then, you could probably abstractly say, well, you know, he got pretty angry in the temple that one time with a whip. So generally speaking, we're living in a world where you have to choose. Do you find flawed persons and just discard them, or do you look for any benefit you can learn from anyone? There's so many people that normally you might say this person is, you know, uneducated, or, you know, an angry, rageful person, or, you know, a plebeian in the streets who's homeless, but you should be trying to get whatever wisdom that person can share generally, even if there's someone you feel like you, especially the people you feel like you can't learn from. Those are the people probably we should be trying to get the most information from. I think there's this idea that just because I hate you doesn't mean I can't learn from you. I think that's probably the biggest issue that I'm seeing today with people.
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. And I think that's just enlightened self-interest. So when you encounter a person or a set of ideas, do you think, oh, this person is just so bad that we'll discard this person, we'll cancel this person? Or do you say, well, I'll try to find something good or something useful about what that person is saying? And that could benefit me. That could add an insight to the way I view the world. It could teach me some practical skills, some lessons that might be possible to apply in the future. So a good example of this, and I'll bring in Charlie Kirk now. I think you can infer my thoughts on the absolutely horrific assassination of Charlie Kirk. But the point I want to make at present is in regard to a good response that I saw to that event from a person who is politically very different from Charlie Kirk, namely Ezra Klein. He's a New York Times commentator. He also has his own YouTube channel. So a generally reasonable liberal Democrat of the abundance persuasion. And he wrote an editorial called Charlie Kirk Was Practicing Politics in the Right Way. And the point that he made was, even though he disagreed with most of the ideas that Charlie Kirk was articulating, Charlie Kirk was doing what one was supposed to do in terms of going out to campuses, debating people, creating spaces where people could engage with him and people could come up and literally try to prove him wrong. That's what he was asking them to do, and present their own ideas. He was giving them a platform, and he was using the means that are specifically appropriate and intended in a small d democratic, small r republic to get people to change their minds, to get the Overton window shifted. And it's so unfortunate that an assassin's bullet cut short his life, because I think that leads a lot of people to draw the wrong implications. Like, some people might be saying, well, Charlie tried peaceful discourse and debate, and this is where it got him. But I think that's giving up on debate and giving up on peaceful discourse too soon, because that's the mode of engagement we need to really step back from the brink and prevent the alternative to peaceful debate, which is violence, which is escalation, which is a potential civil war in this country. And that is an outcome that absolutely needs to be avoided.
Right, and generally the world. I feel like the world itself, countries themselves have even become ideas, and we're at a point where there's a civil, I think a worldwide civil war, an intellectual civil war that's going on with this idea of, maybe, I don't know if it's the individualist versus the collectivist, but there's definitely a group that feels that free speech is not the priority, and that free speech versus hate speech argument is becoming more prevalent right now. I had a hard time with it, obviously, because I was pretty close with Charlie Kirk, and we'd been talking over the years since I met him at Timcast. So when he was shot, I was just going on to my show, Advanced Philosophy Memes, and we had an episode planned called We Have Solutions, because I was thinking about how the world had so many problems in it. And what we tried to do with our show is have conversations with people that have different opinions and ideas, and try to hear out and understand what the differences of opinions are, so that we can maybe find solutions, and focusing on that idea. And I was completely unable to focus because I was watching in the background as he was bleeding out, and while people around him were trying to save him, and the footage that became available, I just couldn't help but focus on those things while it was happening. And I don't know which is worse, because I thought that was pretty terrible. I thought that was one of the most terrible things that, I could see. But the rest of the week was worse, I think, in a lot of ways, because the kinds of information that were put out, for a guy who could no longer speak, who was so eloquent, was infuriating. I was looking at articles like this, Charlie Kirk, white supremacist, dead at 31, right? More Charlie Kirk is dead, but Black America remembers his racism, right? And I mean, most of the interactions I have with people from Turning Point, I have a lot of friends who are persons of color who were members of Turning Point to begin with. There are tons of Black Americans that were excited and felt that their lives changed the moment that they found a solution to being pooled as a sustainable labor force for liberal policies. Doesn't mean that's everyone's experience, but there were quite a few people that I met that were just shocked that he could ever be portrayed as a racist because of his pointing out specifically flaws in our racist infrastructure, right? Systems that he saw as dangerous to Black America, and that Black America existed so much as that it wanted to identify and define itself. So many liberals at the time for the last 20 years have been saying that we're all the same, which is kind of ignoring anyone who wants to define themselves as having some identity that's separate, apart, and different, while not recognizing that we do have a lot in common, right? That there are people that are literally defining themselves as Black America the way Irish America is defining itself. What kind of obscure value does that place on race? Maybe it's abstract, but if someone tells me that they have a different experience because of something like their interest in their culture or their family's culture, or their experience is somehow different than mine, am I supposed to ignore that and not believe that they have a valid right to have that experience? And this is what I started seeing more and more in the description of Charlie Kirk, was maybe that he was ignoring these things that I knew him very well to not ignore. And it's strange, because by not allowing him to speak on those subjects, two things emerge. One, luckily, so much of him is recorded. It's very different than in different times in history, because we have so many recordings now of a person that you can go back, and every single quote that's taken out of context, you can see the full version of the quote, and you'll find, okay, this is actually about DEI. This is not that he has some sort of phobia about Black pilots, or whatever the argument they're making is. But the other thing is that even no matter what you do to show someone the actual context of a clip, if someone's decided they don't want to receive information, then they're not going to. It's very difficult to force someone to have a new perspective that goes against their rhetoric, their logic, and their identity. I think the biggest thing is how much our perspectives are associated with our identity. And it's scary, because I think the main thing I'm seeing is you are not safer for knowing less about what people really think.
Yes, I completely agree with that. And it's shocking, actually, because there is this contrast between what anonymous memes represented Charlie Kirk as saying and what he was actually on camera as saying, because I watched many segments of his interactions on college campuses, including his interactions with Black people and with gay people, and with an actual anti-gay questioner who tried to allege that, well, Charlie Kirk wasn't a true Republican or true conservative because he tolerated gay people in the Republican Party. And Charlie Kirk really hit back hard. And he was saying, well, does that mean that you reject this prominent gay person being part of the Republican Party or this prominent gay person being part of the Republican Party? And he really made an impassioned defense of welcoming as many people as possible into the Republican Party. Now, I am not a member of the Republican Party, but I do appreciate a more open, big tent approach, which Charlie clearly was advocating. And in terms of racism, it's just untenable given how many Black people were allies of Charlie and part of Turning Point USA. So there's a great video, it's a bit over 50 minutes, by a Black gay man named Amir Odom, who worked with Charlie. And he goes point by point in regard to all of these allegations that Charlie was this kind of bigot. And he refutes them not only by showing clips, but also by discussing his personal experience with Charlie. So this is a Black gay man, Amir Odom, who was a friend of Charlie. And when I look at this, I'm always on the lookout for evidence, actual evidence, rather than memes that allege something without a source, without an author, without accountability taken for their creation. So those memes were hit pieces, but here's a human being who is willing to put himself in front of the public saying, no, this is the experience that he had. So I trust that to a much greater extent. I think that is much more solid support. And again, one doesn't have to agree with Charlie on his particular points. One doesn't have to agree with him even on the specific arguments that he's being criticized for, but he was there to debate. And I feel like if I ever had an opportunity to debate him, it would be a good debate because of his manners as a debater. So I didn't ever see him, for instance, insult his opponent in a debate or the other party. I never heard him even condescend, at least to any significant extent. Sometimes the conversations would get heated, but he always maintained a certain standard of civility. And there is actually some insight that I can provide into why that was the case, because he and I come from a similar background in the sense that we both grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, in the North Shore suburbs, which are extremely left dominated. So this is a wealthy area, largely populated by upper middle class and upper class liberals whose kids end up growing up in a bubble. And there's maybe a minority of people who are not liberal, like maybe 10% of the people who live there are conservatives, libertarians, and centrists put together. At least that was the case when I was in middle school and high school. And I was on the debate circuit in suburban Chicago. I am 6.5 years older than Charlie, so he and I would not have crossed paths on the debate circuit. But I met a lot of other, let's say, less left-leaning people, anybody who was heterodox, anybody who was remotely right-wing. And there was a common attitude, a common approach that united all of these people of very differing persuasions, because they had to really hone their arguments. And they had to do it civilly, because if you are in an extreme minority, unless you're a militant, and clearly these people weren't, you don't have the luxury of shouting down your opponents. You don't have the luxury of ignoring your opponents or even walking away from a conversation. You don't have the luxury of living in a bubble. So you have to engage with the views of the other side. You have to actually try to understand what the mainstream positions are. You have to represent them at least somewhat accurately and know why your views are still superior, argue for them, defend them against numerous attacks, and many attacks will be unfair. And I would say Charlie learned this very well. And this is why he didn't even go to college. He started Turning Point USA right out of high school. But I could perfectly sympathize with his frustration. Not, again, that I would agree with all of his points. For example, a big difference between us is I'm an atheist and he was an evangelical Christian. But that is very much a fair area to debate. But I could understand why he would have been of the persuasion that it's really necessary to create this space for debate, because he came of age in an area where you really had to try hard. And to make it out of that with a strong set of views that one could articulate well and defend well, that is very much to his credit.
Right. And I think that was also kind of the beauty of being, he was so young, he was younger than both of us, and it was interesting knowing him when he was in his 20s and seeing how he had changed by 31, because people grow, and the more you interact with people with different opinions, it either changes your arguments or strengthens your resolve. And both were happening. There were definitely things that he'd become far more nuanced about. You know, his unwavering support of certain things became more nuanced for sure, right? He was starting to ask questions about political things that he had before felt he had to draw a objective line in the sand. All of a sudden there was questions that he was willing to ask, and it's not something I've seen a video yet of, but I've noticed there are so many more events than people realize where he said that was a great argument. I really enjoy, you know, like in his Jubilee special, there were people that had completely different opinions of him. It's like, you brought up a really good argument. That's something that's really great. I'm really happy to have debated someone who has a completely different opinion, who brought up this paradigm that I hadn't looked at before. And I will give you that, or I will, you know, concede that point. These are things that most people are ignoring about Charlie, that he was growing as a person so much. And it's always fascinating to watch someone grow. It's a tragedy not to be able to see how he would have changed and what opinions of his would have bent over the years as well. I think that the more you understand someone else, the easier it is for you to debate them. That's also something true probably about, you know, non neoliberals in Chicago, that you have to know pretty well your opposition in order to make arguments against them. You have to know the rules to break them, right? And it's kind of a Carl Saganism that incredible extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof or evidence, right? So that's something that I wish that people were more open to. It's just so scary though, because we talk about free speech and we talk about hate speech. One of the comments I got in my last video, I wanted to pull up, I think it was, Andreas, you keep gaslighting with all this killed for his opinions line. Massive political influence is way different than an opinion from an average person. I thought maybe it'd be worth talking about that. What do you think about that idea? Are massive political influencers different than average persons? I mean, certainly in some ways they are. I mean, how would you say they are? And are their opinions like more dangerous? Is their free speech, is it more important to curtail it? What do you think about that idea?
Well, I would say if there's a difference, it's a difference of degree. He certainly had a larger audience than the vast majority of people, than you or I. One could say he worked hard to earn it. He went to all of those college campuses, and when he started out, it was just him and a table. And he gradually got some donors to support him to scale up his operation. And yes, those donors are prominent Republican Party aligned individuals. So he had Bill Montgomery and Foster Friess, who both died in the early 2020s and their early 80s, but they supported him early on. So he got some leverage for his operation, to be sure, but I think one has to look at the means that somebody uses. So advocacy doesn't become off limits or forbidden just because someone is more successful at reaching larger numbers of people. It simply becomes more effective. Now, content could matter in the sense that yes, if somebody is politically influential, we pay attention to what this person is saying. If we have concerns about what this person is saying, we try to refute those points that he or she is making and try to get to a better set of ideas that are influential. But I think the rules of the game fundamentally must remain the same, because somebody who is just advocating for ideas isn't imposing force, isn't violating anybody's rights. Nobody has to listen to that person, even if he has the ear of the president, as Charlie Kirk did. The president didn't have to listen to him. And who knows what Donald Trump listens to be honest. Donald Trump is famous for essentially going with the last thing he heard. So maybe Charlie Kirk would have told him a few things and he thought, oh, that's a good idea, I'm going to act on it. And then somebody else whispered something in his ear and Donald Trump flipped 180 degrees and did the opposite. And I think with Charlie Kirk, I think he was trying to have an influence on the Trump administration. As you pointed out, his views were evolving. There is evidence to suggest that, for instance, he was evolving toward a more non-interventionist, peaceful foreign policy. And if he had remained alive for longer, he might have had that influence on the Trump administration. But in terms of what people can do, I think it's important to make a distinction between, for instance, speech and incitement to violence. So if a demagogue is riling up a crowd and saying, oh, you need to go to this part of the city now and bash some windows and hurt some people, I would say that's no longer free speech, because that demagogue in the moment could hold an audience spellbound, and there are some crowd dynamics, this mob mentality. People will often lose their individuality in the crowd, and if these mobs form and go and do what the demagogue said, then I think the demagogue could be held responsible for that. But if it's removed in time, so if that demagogue instead writes a book, and this is where perhaps some of my views might be controversial. So let's say Hitler was definitely a demagogue who incited people to violence. He held these mass rallies, and you can bet that people in the aftermath of those mass rallies would have done what Hitler told them to do. But Hitler also wrote this book, Mein Kampf, before he became the leader of Germany, and that book was pretty terrible too. It revealed Hitler's intentions to the world. People didn't take him seriously, but do I think Hitler should have been imprisoned or punished just for writing that book, if that's all he did? No, I think even he was within his rights to have done something like that. And today, well, there are all sorts of ideologues whom I find quite objectionable. A lot of the, let's say, neo-reactionary right, I would disagree with, but they should still be allowed to publish their books. They should still be allowed to give public lectures even. And in giving a public lecture, again, there's a difference in saying, I think X, Y, or Z is true or should happen as a policy, as an eventual outcome, versus you, my loyal followers, must go out there right now and do this thing. So that's the difference between speech and incitement. And also, I would say threats of violence against individuals are not speech. And again, I mean direct threats of violence against specific people. So if somebody says, I don't like this group of people, I think they should be deported, I would say that's a really bad idea. I would say that's an odious idea. I am going to do my best to counter it. But saying that isn't a direct threat. Now, if somebody says to another person, person X, I think you should die, or I am going to do this to you, or you should really be careful about your safety in a way that implies that there's some sort of threat, I think that should be off limits. I don't think that's within the realm of free speech. And I think that's common sense. I think most people will realize when we talk about freedom of speech, we're not talking about something that could be a direct precursor to violence. We're talking about the expression of ideas, of general ways of seeing the world or seeing particular subjects. And I don't think those should be off limits.
I think it's interesting that someone might misunderstand you, right? I mean, so for someone who says advocating for Hitler is wild, I would pull back up this quote: "You were not safer for knowing less about what people think. You were better off knowing what people think. If there are evil people, if that's a good word to use, or if there are people that mean you harm, or mean people you love harm, you were better off knowing it. You were better off knowing the opinions of people that mean you or your loved ones harm. If you try to silence them, you're actually encouraging them to camouflage their dangerous rhetoric. You're making it so that they're dangerous opinions. They might have plans that you don't know because you've actively told them to hide them from you. That is so much worse than a lunatic writing a anti-Semitic book, right? If you're
Right.
better off, it's crazy because people will say that's advocating for it, when really it's pretty clear what we want is transparency of information to the extent of knowing where to look for gunshots or knives, or you want to be able to look evil in the eye and not have to worry about it being behind your back. I think the idea of keeping speech behind your back is basically the only limit you can expect. If you try to avoid having these kinds of ideas in the public space, they'll still exist. They'll just be behind your back where you can't even begin to figure out what to do about it.
Yes, absolutely. And in terms of Hitler, if more people had taken his book seriously in the mid 1920s, he could have been stopped. People could have pointed out that, well, look, this is a person with very definite ambitions to gain power, to perpetrate these atrocities. He's telling us exactly what he believes, and we think he's dangerous. We want to create political coalitions to stop him. And I think he could have, at that point, been stopped peacefully, because in the Weimar Republic, the late Weimar Republic, the German aristocracy, the large business owners, they thought they could use Hitler instrumentally for their purposes. So they kind of invited him in and formed a coalition with him. And if they hadn't done that, Hitler would have been this harmless fringe person. By harmless, I mean he would have had no real political power. And they, by being ignorant of Hitler's ideas, by not appreciating the threat that he posed, made it possible for him to gain power. Probably they didn't read his book. They just thought, oh, who is going to be a good ally in our coalition against the communists or the socialists or the liberals? And so they ended up in a situation where Hitler outplayed them all. So how can we prevent that? It's what you said. It's transparency of ideas. It's seeing people for what they are, allowing them to publish what they please, and then critically evaluating it. So one aspect of free speech that is really important is nobody should be immune from criticism. Not you, nor I, nor Charlie Kirk, nor anyone. Right-wing, left-wing, up-wing, people who agree with us, people who disagree with us. Because that is how we engage transparently, and how we also refine our ideas, how we get closer to the truth. So I am not in favor of silencing people who responded to the Charlie Kirk assassination in ways that were very different from how I responded. Yeah, I'm not in support of firing them. I'm not in support of canceling them. I'm not in support of the Trump administration pressuring television stations to take certain shows off the air, like Jimmy Kimmel. I think what Jimmy Kimmel said was in bad taste, but I think a lot of things he says are in bad taste. That doesn't mean that he should be forcibly prevented from expressing those views. And ultimately, if people choose not to watch him, that's their choice too. But freedom of speech doesn't mean immunity from criticism. Freedom of speech doesn't mean you can't have people disagree with you or people decide not to listen to you. That's all in the realm of free choice. But freedom of speech means you shouldn't be punished in a serious material way for the mere expression of ideas. And of course, we have the First Amendment in the United States. So government at least in principle, shouldn't be able to crack down on you because of your speech. This is where what the Trump administration did in pressuring or influencing TV stations to pull comedy shows off the air is so problematic. But the Biden administration did this too with social media companies. So social media companies were given explicit suggestions from the FBI as to, well, let's tone down this speech about COVID or about social issues or about the Hunter Biden laptop. And that's unacceptable as well. So on the other hand, I even think there should be limits on what private employers can do in regard to speech that's not related to the job. And this is a bit of a discussion I had on one of my recent Facebook posts. Somebody asked, well, what do I think should happen to a person if it's a purely private consequence? And my view is one has to look at employment as a contract where a person agrees to specific types of performance for specific compensation, and both sides should adhere to their contract. So if hypothetically there's a way in which somebody expresses themselves that undermines this, so for instance, if it's a church and there's a pastor who is employed by that church, but that pastor is an open atheist, and that pastor agrees with me because I'm an open atheist, should the church have the right to fire that pastor? I would say so, because that pastor isn't representing the church in its mission, which is to spread its ideas. Now, on the other hand, if this person is not a pastor, if he's a worker at a grocery store, and the owner of the grocery store is a religious person and this worker is an atheist, should the owner of the grocery store have the right to fire this person for being an atheist? I would say no, because you can be an atheist and you can do the exact same job just as well, maybe even better, as somebody who agrees with the ideology or worldview of the grocery store owner. So you have to look at, what does the job require? And is this person doing something that conflicts with the requirements of the job? If so, then I think a firing may be justified as a breach of contract or undermining the contract, but it should never be arbitrary. And I wouldn't support contracts putting in clauses like you may not make controversial posts on social media. No, it has to stem from the actual nature of the job. And actually, that would be more protection than people have today. So today, there are protected categories according to various anti-discrimination laws, like people can't discriminate based on race, sexual orientation, religion, national origin. And generally, I agree with those anti-discrimination protections. I would broaden them to political orientation. I think that's important because right now, political beliefs are a principal fault line in American politics and increasingly in the Western world. So if you have this situation where polarization doesn't just mean people argue fervently with one another, it means people get fired, it means people lose their livelihoods, that would so greatly increase the pressure to conform that we would have more homogeneity in particular areas. So if you live in a left liberal enclave, you might feel the pressure to either pretend to be a left liberal or even gradually become one in order to be accepted by that society, in order to keep your job, in order to be able to still live there. And what will that lead to? I think it could lead to civil war. It could greatly increase the probability of a civil war, because then you would have entire monolithic areas of the country where other monolithic areas of the country are seen as the enemy. And right now, at least, we still have enough of a mixed population in terms of political beliefs that people know some neighbors, some friends, some acquaintances who are of very different views. I live in northern Nevada, and in northern Nevada, if you go from south to north over about a 50-mile distance, you see the entire conventional political spectrum. So in Douglas County, it's a heavily Republican county near Minden, Gardnerville. Where I live in South Carson City, it's more center-right. Carson City is centrist. South Reno is kind of center-left. North Reno is far left. So within 50 miles, you have people of all of these different persuasions, and you get to meet them as human beings, and you get to somewhat understand where they're coming from. And I think that's very useful to have in a society. And that's another reason why cancel culture, censorship are wrong, because they prevent that true diversity of ideas and opinions from being maintained.
Oh man, the camera just jumped on me for 1 second. And we're back. Okay, great. So one of the things I think is interesting about the Jimmy Kimmel situation is that his views are down to like 1 million views from, 40 million or whatever. Like he dropped 75% of his audience over the last few years, and even just from January of this year, dropped I think half of it. It was almost 2 million was what was left at the beginning of the year, and already there were people that were. I mean, I wasn't watching the show anymore. I think a lot of people weren't watching the show, even if they were politically aligned with Jimmy Kimmel. They would have to be caring to watch television, and television is a dying medium in and of itself. So I don't know if this is true, because this is just what the president said, and you have to imagine believing things that Trump said, and maybe that's not what you do. One might think that he's a liar, and that's completely fine. But he had said that he had nothing to do. He didn't officially contact the CIA and go through the Mockingbird church committee hearing control of media conspiracy theory that we're hearing, that he wasn't really saying we have to shut down Jimmy Kimmel, which I think is a really interesting hypothetical. Because if he didn't, if really what happened was simply that people got sick of Jimmy Kimmel, he was saying things that were not funny to that many people anymore, and that Trump, all he did do, because he did talk about Jimmy Kimmel, and there are examples, right? They'll say, Breitbart saying no one banned Jimmy Kimmel, but you can find Trump saying, I absolutely love that Colbert got fired. His talent was even less than his ratings. Might remember Elizabeth Warren saying that Trump has this association with Paramount at the time, and he's saying, I hear that Jimmy Kimmel is next, right? And so when you start talking about opinions and powerful people having opinions, is this tantamount to canceling someone for someone with that much power and sway to say, I hear that Kimmel is next? Is that kind of the same thing? Or is the president in his right to embarrass someone or insult someone out of television? Is that different than what people were saying? Because people were saying he basically forced him to be fired, like some sort of like a Putinian dictatorship or something. Do you see this as similar, or is it different, or how American is that, you think?
Well, I think this is a bit more nuanced in the sense that, yes, you could say Trump did not directly pull the trigger, but the man who did, Brendan Carr, who is the chair of the Federal Communications Commission, is a Trump loyalist. He essentially was put in place by Trump to enforce a kind of Trumpian vision of what media oversight should be. And he is very much of the persuasion that there is a strong left-wing bias in media and in comedy shows, late-night comedy shows in particular, and that this is unfair, that they're beating up too much on Trump, on Republicans, and they need to have more balance, in Brendan Carr's view, and I'm sure Trump would agree. So Trump isn't directly saying, oh, get Jimmy Kimmel fired, but I'm sure if, yes, a post like this were read by a Trump loyalist like Brendan Carr, then Brendan Carr might say, I can score some real political points with my boss, Donald Trump, by firing Jimmy Kimmel or pressuring Jimmy Kimmel to be fired. And I think that's how it often works. It's not like a direct edict from the White House from the top down. It's more like loyalists figuring out what would please their superiors. But this has even been the case in totalitarian regimes. So under Stalin in the Soviet Union, a lot of the murders that took place of political opponents or even ordinary people were not directly ordered by Stalin. Stalin did sign certain decrees to execute his political opponents, but often, say, in some small town or rural village, if a commissar with some armed men came over there and he thought, I want to become prominent in the eyes of Stalin. I want to be rewarded by Stalin for being a good, loyal communist.
Because
What
the
am I going to
alternative
do?
was unlivable, right?
Right. So a lot of these people, they themselves initiated the purges, the executions, and sometimes they were given quotas from the Soviet leadership, like, you must identify 1,000 enemies of the state and liquidate them. And then they would go above and beyond themselves. They would say, well, you asked us to liquidate 1,000. We liquidated 1,500 because they thought this would make them look better. And I don't know to what extent Stalin even knew about all of this. He certainly knew about some of it, but some of it was happening even below the level, not just of Stalin, but of Stalin's direct subordinates. So some people might have been doing this to ingratiate themselves with people who were subordinate to Stalin. And it was this whole totalitarian power structure, this machine, that acted in this way. And my concern isn't, is Trump personally calling all of the shots? Because actually that would be a lesser problem. That would mean the problem is one person. My concern is Trump is creating this machine that could be used to go against people with perspectives that not just Trump himself would find objectionable, because Trump is a person, and a person's views are always nuanced. They can shift, and a person can be reasoned with. But what if it's more of a machine to enforce Republican MAGA orthodoxy? There are people within that orthodox network for Republican MAGA beliefs who are more intolerant than Trump, who would say, for instance, if Trump made a favorable comment about COVID vaccines, these people would become enraged. I mean, Trump had situations where when he was campaigning for president, he said some good things about COVID vaccines. Like he said, I think it should be a personal choice, and they have helped save personal lives. Nobody should be forced to take them. And some people booed him, people from his own camp, which was to some extent surprising, because there's a lot of, let's say, Trump admiration, devotion to Trump. But to another extent, through this MAGA movement, Trump created perhaps an entity or currents of thought that he himself cannot control fully. So this machine that he's creating of pressure, sometimes overt censorship, sometimes, let's say, subtle incentive forming for private actors to make certain decisions, that could outlast Trump. Trump's successor could use it, and the Republican Party apparatus could use it. So that is what's worrisome. This will extend far beyond Jimmy Kimmel, far beyond the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk assassination. And I think we need to have some nuance. So we can condemn the people who say odious things and unjust things about Charlie Kirk, especially in the wake of his death. I think that's in very poor taste. But maintaining their right to say it remains essential for a free country.
Oh my gosh, I'm still looking at comments, and I thought we covered this, but Lewis, I'm going to just say it one more time. You are not safer for knowing less about what people really think. You know, I'm just going to say it until you get it, because that's unless you disagree, in which case, good for you. But I disagree. I think we're not advocating for the rights of people. We are not advocating for the rights of the person who utilizes the hate speech. We're advocating for the victims of the hate speech by making sure that those hateful ideas are expressed so that we can know them. I think that should be clearer. I'm sorry if that wasn't clear enough. Let's try to make that as clear as freaking possible.
Right. And I would say to Luis, What do you think should have happened to Hitler in the 1920s? This was before Hitler ran for office. This was before Hitler became politically powerful. Now, he had this attempted coup in Munich in 1923, and he was put in prison for it, correctly, in my view. So if you try to overthrow the government violently, yes, you should be put in prison. And in prison, he wrote this book, Mein Kampf. What should have happened to him? That's, I think, a very valid question to ask at that stage, because I'm not of the persuasion that disproportionate punishments should apply. Some people would say, well, they would have traveled back in time to kill baby Hitler. They would have been killing a baby. And I find that to be a completely untenable view. I don't believe in killing babies, no matter what.
A lot of people do these days, I've noticed, actually, as a Californian. But someone talked about cancel culture versus consequence culture. So have you heard this now, consequence culture? Is that something you've seen yet?
Yes. And I think the difference there is with cancel culture, it's a totalistic cancellation. So if somebody says something appalling or has said or has been discovered to have said something appalling, then everything has to be turned off for that person, not just online visibility, but any sorts of job prospects, any sort of financial security. That person should be exiled from society, never to return. And consequence culture, I think, is more specific. There's a bit more proportionality. Like, if you do X and there's a consequence of Y that follows from X, then you're not immune to that consequence. And I think that's compatible with free speech. So you could say something that is odious and you could lose followers. Some people might have lower opinions of you. Some people might say, well, I'm not going to watch your show anymore. And with Jimmy Kimmel, that is what should have happened in response to his comments. And maybe then at some point, the network could have made a decision, well, Jimmy Kimmel isn't bringing in as much revenue for that segment, so we're going to figure out something else, either ask him to leave or give him a different role. Some people in the chat have suggested, well, Jimmy Kimmel might do well with a YouTube channel that might not be as popular as a show, but it would still have an audience. And I would say, yes, Jimmy Kimmel should have the right to create his YouTube channel, do what he pleases online, have any other media that he wants to try. So the consequence culture, at least in my view, wouldn't prohibit him from doing that. He wouldn't be exiled from all corners of society. He would still have the right to say what he pleases, just perhaps in a different venue. So it's more reasonable than cancel culture. Of course, it depends on what people think the consequences should be. I don't think the consequence of, say, criticizing the Republican Party or criticizing Donald Trump should be any sort of censorship, any sort of loss of financial position or loss of a show. But I think the free market of ideas should decide as well. So people should decide what they watch or don't watch. If people don't want to listen to me, they don't have to listen to me, but some people might, and I am here to talk to those who do.
I was thinking about where's the link I'm looking for? 2019 Flat Earth on BBC. So saying YouTube aids Flat Earth conspiracy theorists. In 2019, most of the conspiracy theories on the internet were fun because people could debate about them and you could make fun of each other, but you could still have debates. And I think it was easy to say, well, this is the level of extraordinary evidence that you have for your extraordinary claim. Once BBC made this article saying that YouTube is endangering society by promoting ideas that we think should never be questioned, this is about the point when Flat Earth became super popular. Am I wrong? I feel like the super growth of the Flat Earth conspiracies happened when they said, well, why aren't we allowed to talk about this? You know, if we take away the community, there must be something to it if we're not allowed to talk about it. Do you think that that's true, that the more you try to silence something, the more people find interest in it?
there's definitely a certain mindset, a certain personality that does. So I think the flat earth theory is just completely ludicrous. There have been people who tried to test the flat earth theory and it didn't work well for them. But I think, yes, there are some people who have this forbidden fruit type of response. Like if something is not allowed, that makes it more tempting to them. That makes it more appealing to them. They ask, well, why is it not allowed? Who is hiding the truth? Or what are they hiding? So there is this backfiring that happens. There is also a famous story of Barbara Streisand. So Barbara Streisand didn't want pictures of her mansion being revealed in public. And there was some photographer who just innocently took a picture of her mansion and posted it on a website. And it was not a high traffic website, but Barbara Streisand decided to really intimidate this photographer and say, no, you must take this down. There will be legal consequences if you don't. And this photographer just decided to appeal to the internet and say, well, this is a violation of my right to post my work. And so many people, hundreds of thousands of people, agreed with him and started posting pictures of Barbara Streisand's mansion. So she got the opposite of what she wanted. She wanted the privacy. She wanted people not to associate this mansion with her. She got the opposite. Now everyone knows about Barbara Streisand's mansion. And I think it's important to recognize, even with ideas that are false, it's better to let them be expressed and let them be debated. I remember during the early days of YouTube, the format of video where the YouTube atheists would refute some creationist claims. That was very popular. And the atheists wouldn't say, oh, this creationist needs to be censored. The atheists would say, look at these ridiculous arguments. I'm going to spend a whole video debunking them point by point. And I think that was the correct approach, because I would say there are fewer young earth creationists now than there used to be. The YouTube atheist community, I would say, is not as strong as it used to be. Generally speaking, I would say a lot of people today are not as opposed to religion as the YouTube atheists were. However, I would say the YouTube atheists were effective in debunking specific kinds of very fallacious reasoning, as well as the policy implications that stem from that, like the idea that creationism or intelligent design should be given equal standing in public schools to the theory of evolution, I would say is untenable based on the scientific evidence. But the YouTube atheists really went into it in depth and showed point by point why that was. You don't show that by censoring all videos or all expression about creationism or intelligent design. I think people should be free to believe that. It's just students in public schools shouldn't be forced to learn it.
Mm-hmm. One thing I've noticed also, you've used engrams before. I'm sure the book viewer on Google that tells you how often a term has been used in history, and it's kind of interesting looking at cancel culture, for instance, not a popular term until at some point, I think 2015, 2014, it starts to become a thing. Cancel culture emerges as a, in its exponential growth, compared to consequence culture, which apparently was rather popular throughout history. It's been used particularly after the Civil War, which makes sense that they would think that there would be after the antebellum, the postbellum consequence culture, even the 20th century. After, there's a peak actually in 29 that happens, and then it drops off, consequence culture. In the 1950s, we see it again in the communist McCarthy era, and it pops off again in the 2000s, where it drops again when cancel culture emerges, but then it arises again really in before 2020, 2019, even consequence culture starts to emerge. Do you have any, what do you think do you think this is interesting, that consequence culture is a term that's having a renaissance and resurgence.
That's interesting. I'd say consequence culture would have been more prevalent in discourse where there was discussion of, say, taking responsibility for one's actions. And that's probably what the earlier manifestations, if you're looking at the late 19th and 20th centuries, that's how it would have been used. In terms of cancel culture, I would see that as a neologism stemming from the online environment, where essentially the idea of this cancellation, like canceling a subscription to something, was extended to canceling a person. And maybe it's more of etymological evolution, essentially, because in a pre-online world, I guess you could cancel a subscription to a magazine, but associating that with a person, it's just a bit more of a leap mentally to say
it's
that.
dehumanizing.
Right. Now, cancel culture, I would say the term cancel culture arose largely in reaction to de facto instances of cancellation that were not initially termed as such. So when the so-called woke left, woke, by the way, did start out as a self-identification in the mid-2010s, but then over the years it became a pejorative. It started being used by critics of that behavior to identify the more egregious instances. So woke kind of morphed from meaning, well, you're socially conscious, you're aware of injustices that are happening to people, and you're willing to champion the causes of marginalized groups. So that was the self-identifying use of woke. And it became instead a term that meant you are so intolerant of anybody who doesn't think like you that you are ready to impose extremely severe and disproportionately severe consequences for even minor differences of opinion. So it stopped being about, oh, you're in favor of civil rights, or you're against disproportionate amounts of violence being imposed against certain minority groups, and it became, you are someone who is likely to engage in cancellation. So how did that transform? Why is there this, I would say, more than exponential rise in the term cancel culture? The pandemic had a lot to do with it. And that essentially knee of the curve, I would say, happened around 2020 during the George Floyd riots and the reaction to them. And I remember that time very well because for a few days, I thought we were on the verge of some neo-Jacobin takeover, where if you didn't post a black square on your social media, even if you thought that the killing of George Floyd was completely unjustified, even if you thought police brutality is bad and there's systemic racism against black people and that's bad, if you continued to post images of your regular life on Instagram, you were called out for it. If you didn't use sufficiently far left terminology in condemning the killing of George Floyd, even if you condemned the killing of George Floyd, but you didn't use their rhetoric, you were on the verge of being canceled. I remember this because I was targeted as chairman of the Transhumanist Party by a person who tried to convince some of the more left-leaning members to initiate a coup and force me to resign. And the ostensible justification was twofold. One, I wasn't sufficiently vocal in support of the COVID lockdowns. In fact, I did not support the COVID lockdowns. And two, I wasn't sufficiently vocal in support of Black Lives Matter. That was the allegation, even though I put out statements condemning police brutality and saying that we oppose all racism. So, but that wasn't enough for that individual. And his actual motive wasn't the stated set of motives. It was just to get
Clearly.
power. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's pretty funny because I've had people accuse you and I of being, extreme leftists or extreme right wingers in this conversation, probably just right now, depending on which 5 minutes we're talking about.
Right.
It's a good thing that you didn't know the exact numbers about Stalin's purge, because otherwise you would have been claimed to be an advocate of Stalin. If you know too much about history, you should be careful, because it means you're an advocate of what's happened, the atrocities of history, right? This is something, it completely blows my mind. By the way, did you know that Charlie Kirk and George Floyd have the same birthday? Did you know that?
No, I did not.
Yeah, it's
That
kind
is
of a
fascinating.
fun little Barabbas moment, I think. So if you
20 years apart.
If you wanted to have like victims of violence, day, October 14th seems prudent. You could use it for both, and I think that would be a win-win situation. I don't know.
Yes. And I will point out, I think what happened to George Floyd was completely unjust. And I said so.
Which is what Charlie Kirk said this as well.
Yes.
I think this is funny because they always point to the time where he refers to, they say, oh, did you hear that Charlie Kirk called George Floyd a scumbag? And again, he was known for sensational statements, but he said, like, even if George Floyd was a scumbag, did he deserve to die that way? No, he did not. Because someone in the audience was saying, hey, isn't this guy a scumbag or something like that? It's like, even if he was, that doesn't make it okay what happened to him. So of course, the one thing that they say is that he's definitely referring to George Floyd as this, because, like, my God, can you just read what he said? And I have a friend who was saying, he never said anything nice about George Floyd. I'm like, okay, well, please, you say something nice about George Floyd. And he, all he could say was, well, he didn't deserve to die that way. I'm like, interesting, because that's just about verbatim what Charlie Kirk said. He said, did he deserve to die that way? Hell no, of course not. He does not deserve to die that way. But
exactly.
God, it just blows my mind. All it takes is just reading the statements.
And it's interesting, too, because I think the Black Lives Matter movement could have been a lot more successful if it didn't get captured by this toxic form of woke mentality that I described, because police brutality is a real problem. And there are some reforms that could be instituted to make policing in the United States even more similar to policing in European countries. I visited Dublin several times over the past 4 years. And at one point, I remember observing an interaction where there was some rowdy individual and there were multiple members of the local police force there trying to de-escalate the situation, but they weren't carrying guns. They were trying to talk this person down. They were actually trying to reason with this person and say, okay, can you please calm down? Trying to explain the situation. And this person was kind of gradually coming to his senses. But I think this person would have panicked if he thought, well, the police have guns. The police are going to kill me. My life is in danger. I'm going to have to do something to protect myself. So there are better ways of policing, and that's a conversation we should have had. But it's not a conversation that most people are going to be open to having if the rhetoric from the movement that encourages these reforms are, you're an inherently evil person and you're guilty for the sins of your ancestors, or even not really your ancestors, but people who look like you. And if you disagree with any of that, not only are you a racist, but you have white fragility because you refuse to acknowledge how guilty you are. So I think that was highly counterproductive. And for about 2 years, a lot of people played along with it because they were afraid of the social consequences of not playing along with it. They saw prominent cancellations. Like there was a composer named Daniel Elder who, in the wake of these riots, essentially made a post on social media saying, well, he doesn't like things burning down. And he went to bed thinking, well, this is just a legitimate opinion. And when he woke up to so many death threats, denunciations. He lost all of the commissions that he previously had lined up. He had no income for a while. And he has said he was so depressed that he was seriously contemplating suicide. Of course, nobody should ever do that. But this was featured in Reason magazine a couple years later as an example of the injustices that were perpetrated on fairly ordinary people during that time period.
Yeah, I mean, so I was living in Minneapolis. Actually, I was living just outside of Minneapolis, thank God, but I was about 20 minutes away. And at the time, my girlfriend's sister worked at the Walgreens pharmacy, which was destroyed. And she was, a George Floyd supporting liberal who voted for Waltz, a Democrat, etc. Actually pretty left for a Democrat even. I think a lot of Democrats aren't necessarily leftists. They're just, they can be like progressives that were, but she was rather leftist and a member of BLM, etc. She was told she had to get out of the building as soon as possible because they were coming, like this was the Lord of the Rings or something. And the building was burned and destroyed, and it was the mobs tore it apart trying to get all the pharmaceutical pills and money that they could get out of the machines. There really wasn't that much, like useful drugs that you could sell or value. Really what they had was high blood pressure medication, diabetes medication, things like that were really important to the inner city people. And if you're a rich white person who has a nice car and you can go to another town and you can get your high blood pressure and diabetes medicine, that probably didn't bother you. But if you're a person of color without any money in inner city Minneapolis who doesn't have a vehicle, like some old lady, or something like that could have killed. Well, I think a lot of people did die for a lot of reasons, but one reason that would be really terrible is because this riot destroyed your access to diabetes medication and insulin. And this was something that was going on. People don't really understand that riots don't necessarily help the people they're intended to help. They might make a public nuisance that is read about and heard about around the world, but does that really bring the changes or the solutions that people are hoping for? I wonder about that sometimes. And I wanted to also bring up a point that, we've got Lewis here, and they said, debating fascists shouldn't be a thing. And I wanted kind of to like expand on that logic. I want to think about what you mean by that, because I want to know what you mean when you say fascist. Like, how do you define a fascist? I would say, for me, a fascist is maybe, kind of a general term now, but a political stance that seeks to suppress opposing viewpoints, right? Usually through coercion and maybe through exclusion and censorship, and rather than engaging in open discourse, like forcing this person not to speak. It just seems ironic because it sounds to me like by refusing to debate someone that you're deeming as a fascist, you're kind of being you're being what I would consider a fascist. I don't want to label you. I'm sure, Lewis, you don't like to be called a fascist any more than someone else likes to be called a fascist. But it's just, what do you mean when you say fascist? And what do you justify as a reason not to have an open discourse with them?
Yes. And I would say, too, it's important to go back to the historical meaning of fascism. So fascism originated in Italy under Mussolini, and it was an ideology of state power, but unlike communism, it was state power in coordination with private institutions. So institutions stayed nominally private, but the government would control how they use their assets. So the factory owners could keep their factories, maybe make some profit from them, but the government would tell them what to produce. The government would control the cultural institutions. The government would say, well, you have to produce this cultural output, you may not produce this other cultural output. And another characteristic of fascism, fascism was named after really two terms. One is the fascio. These were the armed bands of militants who were the initial support base for Mussolini. And the other one was the fasces, the Roman bundle of rods. The idea of that was if you have these rods bundled together, an individual rod is hard to break, but bundling them together would make them very difficult to break. You can't just snap them apart. So that was a Roman term that Mussolini appropriated because he was an admirer of the Roman Empire. But fascism is inherently a collectivist ideology. The fasces, the bundle of rods, that's a very collectivist metaphor. And as an individualist, of course, I have a very different view of the world. But fascism is a specific system. It's a collectivist ideology that creates this system of state control in coordination with nominally private actors, where the outcome is a centrally planned economy, a centrally planned culture with very little room for individual expression or individual deviation, and also a cult of the strongman. Now, I think some people could say there are elements of fascism in, say, what the Trump administration is doing, but there are also clear elements of non-fascism and the absence of a lot of other elements. Like, I don't think there's a very strong collectivist ideology on the MAGA right. I think they're more open to actual diversity in terms of businesses and a great deal of private enterprise still. And they're even open to a great deal of cultural expression. Yes, they don't like what they would consider some of the woke culture, but they would probably tolerate 99% of cultural expression through the year 2010. And this is a hypothesis, I don't know, but it does not seem to me to be at least that level of control that Mussolini or Hitler or Franco tried to impose. And one problem, of course, is the term fascism has strayed so far from its original meaning. And especially on the left, it's just used as an insult. And I remember back when I was in suburban Chicago, so taking part in the same circles, the same activities that Charlie Kirk would have taken part in, fascist was still used as an insult back then. I remember a lot of people using the phrase Bush Hitler because they thought Bush was a fascist, George W. Bush.
Even though he's technically a neo-Trotskyite, conservative.
But I think their arguments were, well, the Iraq War is deadly to the local population, and there were other civil liberties abuses, which there certainly were with the Patriot Act, with some warrantless surveillance that was taking place during that time, and I don't want to minimize those, but I would not call the George W. Bush administration fascist. There was a great deal of free speech that was occurring and was allowed more than today under the George W. Bush administration.
You had Muhammad cartoons on South Park. The world was a very different place.
Yes.
It was weirdly more free. But I mean, I agree. I think that's even further and deeper nuance than I was looking to go, because I think it's true. Using the word fascist, these people have no idea what that word means. They have no idea that it comes from Italian collectivism, and that it's even a romanticism that Mussolini had about Roman periods that might not even have existed in the sense that we really believe them to, right? We have this, you go to Spain today and you'll see bundles of fasces on every sewer, and they have nothing to do with what people think that word means. But in the sense that the word is being used by the woke, or by people who consider themselves neoliberal. I think like neoliberalism has kind of taken this term to mean anything that opposes their agenda, and saying that we have values. These are important values. These are our democratically evolved values that we've worked hard. We've struggled so far in history to achieve these values, and that we shouldn't even allow discussion with anyone who doesn't have those values. I think that's really dangerous, because that's exactly the same kind of ideology that the Nazis had. That's basically the whole point of what the Nazis were saying, was that they had achieved some sort of moral superiority that was unquestionable, and that they shouldn't be forced to have conversations with people that had different values than them, and that those people should be re-educated. And it's really scary to me how people are saying that this is the justification for not only not having conversations with people, but literally shooting them, like literally violence as a reasonable cure for people with different opinions. And by refusing to debate and advocating for silencing opponents, I think that that is acting in line with their own definition of fascism or moral superiority and pretentiousness. It's enforcing ideological conformity by exclusion, which is like really the very behavior that they're pretending and claiming to oppose, right?
Yes. And it's ironic too. I would say the greatest exemplar of this in the current situation is, of course, Tyler Robinson, who killed Charlie Kirk. And we have seen the text messages that he sent to his partner. And one of the lines there, when his partner asked, well, why did you kill Charlie Kirk? By the way, his partner is a transgender person, but knew nothing of the murder and was, it seems, genuinely surprised and shocked at this. So I place this squarely on Tyler Robinson's shoulders, but the partner asked, why did you kill Charlie Kirk? What for? And Tyler Robinson said, well, Charlie Kirk is full of hate, and some hate can't be negotiated out. That was his line. And when I read that, I thought, wow, that is some projection. Some hate can't be negotiated out.
Absolutely.
That was the hate within Tyler Robinson that led him to decide he couldn't even engage with Charlie Kirk. I mean, a lot of people disapproved of what Charlie Kirk had to say, and they debated him and they argued with him. And sometimes they did well, sometimes they did not so well. But that would have been a very understandable way of engaging. But the idea that some hate can't be negotiated out, I think that's a personal projection. And there are so many counterexamples to this too. I bring up the case of Daryl Davis, who is a black man. I think he's a
that's hilarious. I was
yes.
literally just pulling him
yes.
up as you said that. That's amazing. Okay.
Yeah, so Daryl Davis is known to have kind of de-radicalized a lot of Ku Klux Klan members. And he did go to the KKK rallies and he befriended a lot of Klansmen. And he didn't initially just attack them and say, oh, you're evil because you hate black people. Instead, he actually tried to understand where they were coming from, and he treated them nicely to give them an understanding that, oh, black people are just like them, essentially, in fundamental ways and the ways that matter. And
this is pretty much how you have to treat people that, you know, like for instance, the people that are upset at Charlie Kirk. I can't just go around hating people that hate someone because they don't know any better, because they were miseducated, misinformed by people that they loved who were also misinformed. At a certain point, you have to break not only the cycle of violence, but the cycle of ignorance, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting, too. You're showing screenshots from this TED Talk. It has 12.96 million views, almost 13 million views.
Right, yeah.
And that shows that this is a highly effective approach, that at least people were intrigued to understand how Daryl Davis was able to do this. And this is perhaps part of the solution. I really think part of the solution is more discourse, not saying, oh, there's some hate that can't be negotiated out, but saying, how can we reach these people? Because it really is imperative to de-radicalize people on both the extreme left and the extreme right. People who get stuck in these echo chambers like Tyler Robinson did. So Tyler Robinson is clearly a very online individual. He used memes that only a very online individual could know. And again, I'm not saying being very online is inherently bad or that it would inherently lead to this kind of behavior, but perhaps being very online combined with certain personality traits, certain proclivities could lead to this kind of behavior. And I think there are people who are genuinely bad at debate, who actually don't like the clash of ideas and aren't comfortable with it, they are more likely to adopt the mindset of Tyler Robinson that, oh, some people are just hateful, they're bad, and there's no negotiating with them. Because they don't want to argue, they don't want to negotiate, they're not good at it, they're not comfortable with it. And what I've actually found in my own experience, the most intolerant people in this polarized climate, they're not the ones who argue the loudest. They're not even the ones who insult you openly. Because at least if they're insulting, if they're attacking you, that's how they're engaging with you. They're the quiet ones. They're the ones who are so upset at what somebody else is saying that not only are they not engaging, but they're plotting something behind the scenes. It's like in any high stakes situation, any sort of adversarial situation, any sort of negotiation, as long as communication is proceeding, even if it's hostile communication, like, what are you doing? This is a ridiculous offer. I can't possibly accept that, etc. That is still a sign that some progress could be made. Where one has to get really concerned is when the communication goes quiet, because then you really don't know. And how do you reach those people? Not the people who argue the loudest, but maybe Daryl Davis has a good idea, because again, just because someone doesn't like to debate doesn't make them a bad person either, but they have to be reached in a different way. And that could be some sort of attempt at friendship, some sort of attempt at mutual understanding. And of course, Daryl Davis wasn't just saying, oh, I'm a black person, you Klansmen should understand that I'm really a good guy. He was giving some of that too.
Yeah, I think interaction is a major thing that's missing on the internet, because, you know, it used to be that through the internet we could connect all over the world and we would be in one chat room because there were so few of us. And now there's millions of chat rooms that are all isolated from each other. There's a serious balkanization that's happening. I'm in the Balkans right now, and I think that's actually a pretty good term for what happens. I mean, it's amazing to go from Bosnia to Montenegro to Croatia to Albania, and each time you go, they're excited to see you, but then you mention you're going to go to Albania or you're going to Bosnia, and they're like, oh my God, don't go to Albania. That's 30 miles away. They're crazy over there. And even the way they feel about each other is very different than they felt when they were one place, at least unified against the common Buberian else, right? Martin Buber talked about, you know, unanimity -1, I and thou. And I think we really live in a world that has divisive identity politics as a way that we define ourselves. Who are we? Well, we're not them. That's a big part of who we are. And the more you have to interact with people, the more cosmopolitan your outlook is, the harder it is to pretend how unique we really are. I mean, how distinct we really are. There's important distinctions we make based on our choices, but it's amazing when people say, oh, well, we have a very unique culture. You know, we really care about food. Oh, you do, really? You know, that's so different than these other people who care about food. They don't love to eat. You know, what are you even saying, right? This is the world that we live in, that people think they're more distinct than they are, based on things that really unite us so much. And also violence as a tool of the defeated, I've noticed, is a big thing. If you're unable to communicate, if you're unable to use language, then violence is a pretty common next step for people. It's interesting how quick we can go from words to violence. Tupac talked about this. When people lose an argument and they lose influence and they forfeit their ability to win in the ground of discourse, then their next resort can be force. And violence is a pretty bad way to restore that influence. It's an interesting thing that they think that violence will somehow, maybe if it doesn't restore influence, it'll command sort of, it's the last word. If you can use violence in a way that destroys someone else, then they can't have any more influence, I think is maybe the goal. But it usually doesn't work that way. I think violence ends up destroying one's own influence, turning someone into a mythological martyr. That's what I've noticed is interesting, is this guy who was kind of, to me, I mean, I never thought that Charlie was, you know, a deity. You know, he was a kid who was also a born-again Christian. To me, born-again Christians are, you know, I mean, I'm just saying, like, at the same time, it's cool to talk to them, but it's not like the deep end of the pool, and now all of a sudden you're going to turn him into Jesus Christ, which is it's amazing. I think that's kind of great, like that this kid just turned into Jesus Christ. That's pretty much it was his goal. It's horrible way to do that. It's something that's so tragic to happen. I mean, his family don't deserve a mythological figure as a replacement for a father. I think that that's not something that's really fair or just. But at the same time, the more you try to destroy something, the more Obi-Wan you're going to make them. And, you know, it's just ironic because this desperate act of survival that is violence is not a path to truth or justice. But it is a path to creating a mythological figure out of this thing that you've fought against. It really empowers the other side far more than it weakens them. I wish people would understand that.
Yes, absolutely. Tyler Robinson created a martyr of Charlie Kirk. And now many more people know who Charlie Kirk was than knew when Charlie Kirk was alive. I think Tyler Robinson clearly didn't intend to have that effect, but this speaks to another point. A lot of the people who engage in this kind of political violence, not all of them, but many, are young men. And I think demographically, that's just true. I think there are specific reasons for this. If you take, say, Crooks, the would-be assassin of Donald Trump during the first assassination attempt, also a young man, also fairly quiet. We don't see him expressing himself very much online or engaging in debates, but perhaps he didn't feel like he needed to. He just disliked Donald Trump so much that he thought he would take Trump out instead of using all of the many political and societal channels that we have to oppose anything that Donald Trump would try to do. So it's that archetype. And again, it's not everybody. Ryan Routh, the second attempted assassin, is middle-aged. I think he's in his 50s, also radicalized online. But why is it also that the majority of crimes are committed by young men? I think this really speaks to a society that is failing young men in a significant way, because young men are looking for meaning. They're looking for a way to distinguish themselves, to establish themselves, to get respectability, to get responsibility and the authority that comes with this responsibility. If all of this happens well, if it happens in a way that gives them all of these goals to which they aspire, young men would have no reason, no incentive to commit crime. But imagine young men who are frustrated, who aren't getting respect or recognition or a clear pathway to upward mobility. And they're physically stronger than everybody else. And they have more energy than everybody else. And they can still learn things very quickly, including some quite destructive habits or destructive skill sets, like learning how to operate a rifle with precision. What are they going to do with that? Well, I think with a society that we have now, where there are no clear pathways to upward mobility, there has been this erosion of meaning that I've discussed as a result of the postmodern era and its influence, its deconstruction of prior systems of meaning. A lot of young men are feeling adrift, and they latch on to anything that gives them that sense of either meaning or a sense of agency. So the young men who do the worst things, who act out in the way that Tyler Robinson did or that Crooks did, they're trying to kind of immortalize themselves in a way by doing something so horrible that it gets noticed. And this is why I believe it's essential to propagate an alternate system of meaning, a newer system of meaning that doesn't have some of the flaws of the older systems, namely transhumanism. It does contain some elements of prior systems of meaning, of humanism, of the Renaissance, of the Enlightenment, of the confidence and progress that we can have better lives through science, technology, and reason. And with the possibilities that are on the horizon, people should be genuinely enthusiastic. This should have been an age of widespread optimism if we didn't have this societal malaise, this polarization that has been derailing so many minds, especially young minds. And you and I, Andreas, are middle-aged now, so we
Not
have,
if we're transhumanist, Gennady.
well, we can just be middle-aged indefinitely, I think.
All right, I'll take it.
But relative to the people who are getting radicalized in a lot of these online echo chambers, sometimes we are twice as old as they are. So
I've seen it.
Yeah, we have now a bit more perspective, a bit more experience, and I think people who have gotten past that period in their lives, and people who have gotten a certain sense of maturity, wisdom, proportionality in how they respond to particular events or even particular provocations, they have a lot to teach young people. And maybe we can use our influence to some extent to depolarize, de-radicalize many of them, show them a pathway of meaning, whatever specific things they find meaning in, that is non-toxic, that is non-destructive. Because I think the basic ground rules of any civilized society are: we use words, we don't use violence. And before we even get people to agree with us on specific policies or ideas about culture or society or the future, those basic ground rules need to be firmly established and propagated through all possible channels. And at this stage, I don't care what the political orientations are of the people who do that, as long as they help to establish those ground rules. I think there are allies in this.
Absolutely. I think the left and the right have become infrastructure for the top to control the bottom. Scarlett says the idea that we should willfully platform hate and debate led to the election of Donald Trump. I can prove you wrong. I'll do it in a second. MAGA doesn't want equality. They want a theocracy. They want people to suffer. Well, let's start with your first claim. So I would say the opposite is the case, actually. The echo chambers that Facebook made possible have been well documented. The amount of people that became upset about policies or ideas or persons they didn't like and blocked them led to the surprising defeat for so many people who were absolutely shocked to find that they weren't the majority of the country. This is exactly the opposite of what you're saying, and there's ample proof of it, that people were not interested in having debates. We're not interested in having conversations. And you can explain this however you want, that it was because people had toxic interactions, people were trolling each other on the internet, people weren't having civil debates. I think that's a great truth, that people were yelling and saying mean things to each other. Something that Charlie Kirk did not do, by the way. I think that's kind of what we're getting at, was he did everything he could to keep the communication lines open with people that had different opinions so that they could be heard out, so he could be heard out. But generally speaking, it's true. Most people didn't have those communication skills. And on the internet, people would fight with each other. I've seen it happening this week, actually, plenty. And what happens? Well, people block each other, and you end up in an echo chamber of people that agree with you. And guess what? You can't convince people that are already convinced if you're preaching to the choir. So there's no growth in your group. There's only galvanization. In fact, you might find smaller and smaller groups of more and more fanatical people that believe in just the same thing. And eventually that group becomes so small it cannot sway public opinion. That's exactly how Trump won. Trump was able to take the disenfranchised voters, the disenfranchised users of these groups that were kicked out, and they were incredibly diverse. If you think about it, you had Latinos for Trump, Asians for Trump, fat black women for Trump. I'm just telling you the names of the groups. I didn't come up with them. There were evolutionists and Darwinists for Trump. Transhumanists, literally, there were transhumanists for Trump. Krav Maga, right? The Israeli Zionists for Trump. The Palestinians for Trump. The Somalis for Trump. I'm not kidding when I say the tent was filled, and it was filled with people that were completely diverse, people that were completely opposed to each other a year prior. They were so sick and tired of the group that they had been ostracized from, which became smaller and smaller and more fanatical. I think this is something we noticed with the DNC, that they latched on to very specific causes, right? I think this is true generally up until the last 3 or so years, because now you're seeing exactly, I would agree with you, Scarlett, like a Christian right push for control over the Trump vote, the same way that we saw with the Democratic Party in the 1960s, or the Republican Party in the 1980s with Reagan. The Christian right, or this religious right, this does emerge, and there is some sort of an exclusion to the groups that existed. But there were gays for Trump, like Milo Yiannopoulos, etc. There were every kind of person that normally would have not agreed with each other. And that disenfranchised vote was able to expand that party because they were able to have different kinds of conversations, which led to an extremely powerful and potent meme culture where they were able to share these reactions and have reaction, because engagement algorithm is the way that the internet grows. So if you have an engagement algorithm versus a fanatical pool of echo chamber, the echo chamber gets less and less engagement from the algorithm. And the more reactions you're getting, people laughing at each other, not even just with each other, but at each other, or commenting you're crazy or you're stupid or whatever, that increases engagement. So it's important to understand that. I think that's one of the most important points that we're making, that free speech led to the Trump, whether you like it or not, right? And I'm not saying this as an advocate necessarily for the way things turned out. I'm just explaining it's the exact opposite of what you say. The idea that we should willfully platform hate and debate led to the election of Trump is demonstrably false. It's demonstrably false. It's the exact opposite circumstance. And then just as a side, Stefan says the reason he wants nothing to do with Christianity is because of the Christians, the way they treat the Native Americans. Have you heard of the Mormons? I'm just kidding. But yeah, so sorry, Gennady. I thought you wanted to say.
Well, I'll say on the point about the Christians. So I'm not a Christian. A lot of people who treated Native Americans badly happened to be Christians. There were also many more Christians who had nothing to do with Native Americans historically. So think about, say, Russian Orthodox Christians. Well, there was a little bit of interaction in Alaska in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Okay. But even there, it wasn't the same as, say, in the central United States during that time. So to say you don't like Christians because these bad things were done to Native Americans, I would say that's a collectivist portrayal. That's painting with a very broad brush. It's not looking at individual Christians and what they believed and what they did. And I'm an individualist, both methodologically and ethically. So I'm going to look at a person as a person in totality, not just based on a single ideology or a single belief. And two people can be Christians and they can interpret their Christianity in very different ways. There's a Christian Transhumanist Association that has a lot of people who I would say are really good and valuable transhumanists. We need them in order to advance the cultural conversation. And then there are, of course, the kinds of Christian fundamentalists who say essentially all transhumanist projects are the work of the devil, and lab-grown meat should be banned, and gene editing should be banned, etc. So very different Christians. And I would say it depends less on ideology and more based on temperament. This was suggested in some of my earlier remarks, but I would like to expand on this because I think the pushback that we're getting is, well, we shouldn't platform hateful ideologies, etc. But I think the hate actually arises not from the ideology itself necessarily. It arises from other pre-ideological emotional dispositions of the people espousing certain ideologies. And there could be affinities. So people with certain personality issues may be more likely to gravitate to particular ideologies, like, let's say, neo-Nazism. And a lot was done to study the psychology of the original Nazis, what led them to become Nazis. And in part, it was this kind of follower mentality, this idea that, of course, they felt that they were wronged after World War I with the Treaty of Versailles. They felt the pain of the Depression. They felt the pain of the hyperinflation under the Weimar Republic, and they didn't want to do the hard work of actually figuring out solutions themselves. They wanted a leader to tell them how to think. So that kind of follower personality led a lot of people in Germany in the 1930s to become affiliated with the National Socialist Party. I would say today, the personality that is most inclined to this kind of behavior is the frustrated, disenfranchised young male who seeks a certain sense of meaning and purpose, but isn't getting it, doesn't see a clear pathway toward getting it, and tends to have rather extreme tendencies in terms of how to respond to it. So anybody with a penchant for acting out like an explosive temperament, or somebody, on the other hand, who is so averse to conflict and so averse to any sort of engagement that they would rather just act out on their own, the lone wolf kind of archetype. So I would say we have more to fear from certain personality types in this media environment, in this political, cultural environment. It's not necessarily that those personality types are even bad inherently. In a different society with different material constraints or opportunities, those personality types would manifest themselves differently. Like, say, Alexander of Macedon in one era could be Elon Musk in a different era, just as a hypothetical. So I think the people who say, well, we can't platform certain views, they're missing this whole dimension of personality and how that plays into it, and how that leads some people with the exact same ideology as other people to really interpret it very differently and be either more benign or more destructive.
Another thought, not that it's super important, but just bringing up Matt Walsh. I saw a comment from Scarlett saying that she went to advocate for transhumanism with Matt Walsh. I've met Matt a few times, and while I find him tedious, especially his hatred for anime, which is whatever, but like when you talk to him about transhumanism, I actually used a line Gennady gave me talking about Dante, right? Because Dante refers to the term transhumanar in Paradiso, and it's pretty much the earliest term for both transhumanism, but also it's essentially the first word for Christian, right? This is the idea to experience the full extent and realize the complete potential of the human being. And I think that's an important distinction. And Matt liked that. I don't know how much he loved it, but he definitely heard it. There was something that he had to accept about that. So in a way, I would take your point and push it further that transhumanism is a really important thing to discuss with people that don't understand it. And I'm constantly surrounded by people that think transhumanism means something it doesn't on some level or another. I would also say, I mean, the transgender ideology as it relates to transhumanism is, they're obviously very different terms that mean completely different things, but it's interesting because transgenderism does relate, I think, very much to the Christian right and generally to right-wing ideology. If you've really studied race, class, and gender, engenderment is this idea of social expectations of what we should be expecting of a sex, whether it be the male or the female or anything that is fitting in some analog of in between, right? And this is even something that Charlie Kirk was aware of, even though he said he didn't believe in gender. It's completely obvious as time was going on that he was becoming more and more aware that we have social expectations of a woman or a man, and that these define whether or not we ascribe ourselves to being a man or a woman. And it's a right-wing idea to conserve the collective's social expectations rather than to allow and embrace the individual's experience, which is interesting. In other words, there's no reason why a person should have to switch the social engenderment based on what society expects of them when they can simply be themselves and change the societal definition of a gender. There's no expectation that requires you to live up. I mean, unless you really are part of some religious or social group that demands that a woman is a way, that you should have to become the way they define a woman to be for you. You can define being a man or a woman however you want to be defined. You can be yourself. And this is something I think that steps away from the idea of transgenderism, because it really is a conservative ideology to protect the social engenderment. There's no one who's going to tell me that I have to be a man who plays football. I have to be a man who has a mustache. There's no one who should be allowed to tell you that you have to be a woman who has a baby, or you have to work in a kitchen, or you have to be barefoot. And it really is interesting to me that so many people I've met who consider themselves to be transgender are coming from places that are extremely right-wing or extremely conservative, that have extremely traditional social expectations thrust upon them. And if you live in a place that doesn't do that, you'll notice, I mean, if you're raised in a place that doesn't have those same social expectations, it's demographically evident that there are less people who switch, quote unquote, their genders rather than just living the way that they want to live. And that doesn't mean that you can't take hormones that augment yourself. I think this is another example of transhumanism, that you're allowed to exist and self-realize in any way you want and augment yourself in any way that you think benefits you. But that's very different than conforming yourself to society's expectation of a race, a class, or a gender, something I think we should be very careful about confusing the nuances of.
Yes, and these are good points. In fact, I have often been opposed to overly rigid gender norms in terms of people's expectations of, say, what a real man is like or what a real woman is like. Like, a real man likes to watch football and drink beer out of red plastic cups and drive a pickup truck and do a lot of manual work around the house. And if you don't do that, you're not a real man. Well, that really limits the scope of what a man can be. And likewise, for a woman, there are a lot of stereotypes that are perhaps unjustified, and there should be more room for individuals to define that for themselves. What does that mean? But in terms of, I would say, the whole controversy about transgenderism, it's interesting because it reminds me in part of the controversy about gay marriage in the early 2000s, extending to the mid 2010s. So if there were people who were kind of on the fence on that issue initially, and even a lot of people who were opposed to it because it wasn't really commonplace, it wasn't within their sphere of awareness. Over time, over the course of about 15 years, a lot of people became more receptive. And by the time the US Supreme Court legalized gay marriage in 2015, most Americans were accepting of it. So what changed in between? I think for a lot of people, especially people who weren't closely following the political debates, this was because some friend or acquaintance or family member of theirs ended up being gay and eventually announced themselves as gay. I had a friend in high school who was like that. And it was only a couple years after high school, when we were in college, that he actually essentially admitted to me that he was gay. And I had no idea. I will be honest, I had no idea. I had spent 6 years interacting with this individual, and I realized, well, he's no different of a person after he made that confession to me than he was before. So that led me to think, and I think a lot of other people had similar experiences, and that's how the majority of Americans came to be in favor of gay marriage. So if the problem is, as Scarlett is saying, well, some people are just not accepting of transgender persons, they're not willing to acknowledge their right to exist, etc. Well, could this be due to limited exposure? Could this be due to perhaps some stereotypes? Because it's clear in other contexts of prejudice, like countries in Europe that have the most prejudice against immigrants tend to have fewest numbers of immigrants. So countries that have a lot of immigrants from many different countries, where the population is used to interacting with immigrants, they tend to have more tolerant views of immigrants. So it could be very similar with transgender people. And if somebody knows somebody in their day-to-day interactions who is transgender, that could sway their perception, as long as that person is a good person, and as long as there's a recognition that that person being transgender doesn't change the fact that they're a good person. I think a lot of people who are opposed to the transgender movement, they also see the extremes online, like all of the hatred and death threats that people like J.K. Rowling or Riley Gaines have faced from self-proclaimed transgender activists. But I think that's a militant fringe. But anybody who's going to face death threats, anybody who's going to face this kind of online hate, is going to have their perception colored by that. So I would say the challenge for the transgender movement, the transgender rights movement, is to create that kind of perception shift that happened on the issue of gay marriage. So I don't think gay marriage is going to be reversed. I don't think the Trump administration is going to take action to reverse it, because a lot of prominent supporters of Trump are themselves gay. So could we reach a point in our society where even the ostensibly reactionary side of an issue has some transgender people in prominent positions? Maybe that could help.
I think so. And we know, I mean, we know in our audience a number of transgender supporters of Trump. I've known many over the years. It's actually surprising how many exist. But it relates back to one thing Scarlett said: do you support the abolishing of gender? And, you know, personally, when I think of the word gender, like I described, I'm not talking about biology at that point. I'm talking about social expectations. And do I believe that we should abolish or denounce social expectations of the individual? Hell yeah. I think it's a big fascism, like dog whistle, if you will, that we have to expect certain behaviors. I don't think expectation of these behaviors is healthy. And you know who else felt that way? Was Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk talked about this rather commonly, that he felt that gender was essentially an unreal idea, something that was being blown up as an idea around biology, but really comes back to social expectation. And I think you could solve everyone's problems just by removing social expectation. The people that are worried about kids being transgendered because of social expectations of what a gender is, whether, a boy paints, so therefore he's a girl, or a girl likes fire trucks, so that she's a boy. These were the issues that the right wing, conservative, religious, and anti trans, as you put, groups latched onto to say that they shouldn't be augmenting children to conform to social expectations of gender. I think you would completely solve everyone's problem if you did away with those social expectations of gender. And I've seen it work as a kid raised in California, where there wasn't really that many social expectations placed on boys and girls in Santa Cruz, California. A lot of the Bay Area, I think we kind of grew up in the future in that sense. And I've seen so many people who came to California who became transgender because they're from Iowa, and they thought, well, my brother was a football star and I'll never be a football star. So, I mean, I really liked the way my aunt was. And if I can't be good at being like my brother, then I can be good at being. This is a crazy thing that we've done to create these social expectations, which we're defining as gender. And we can move past that and allow people just to be who they want to be. And that would be completely comfortable. There's no reason why a libertarian's upset at you if you want to augment your ears. Why would they be upset if you wanted to augment your genitals? The more you look at neoliberalism, there's room for nuance in all of these ways, except for in demands of social expectation. So yeah, I think that's the first thing that we should be careful of, is social expectations of gender. And even beyond that, it's of race and of class. Race, class, and gender are the most dangerous things to allow collectivists to control. These should be in the hands of the individual's own self-determination and pursuit of happiness.
Yes, and I definitely support individual self-determination and pursuit of happiness. I do think people should have the right to adopt certain gender norms if they so choose, or certain ways of expression if they so choose, but there shouldn't be pressure to either conform or to say that, oh, one isn't of a particular gender if one doesn't have a certain form of expression. So I hope that you heard what I said just now, because there seems to have been a little bit of an outage.
I caught it.
Yes, but the idea is, yes, the individual should make those determinations, and people shouldn't be, let's say, confined to overly rigid boxes or stereotypes in this regard. And they shouldn't think necessarily that just because they don't conform to a particular stereotype, oh, that must be that they have the other gender. It's a lot more nuanced than that. And they are foremost individuals. And I think you can be male or female and have a wide array of interests, pursuits, other attributes associated with that, aesthetic choices, ways in which you view the world, that don't inherently change you from one to the other. And there are some people who experience gender dysphoria, and I think it should be their right to transition if they so choose. If they're fully competent legal adults, that's their right. Nobody should try to limit those rights. But interestingly enough, in some ways, I feel like that was a widely accepted position back in the late 2010s. And then something happened with the hyperpolarization, the rise in cancel culture. Again, people looking to the extremes, including these militants comprising some portion of the transgender community, and there was a backlash. So how do we again de-escalate, depolarize, allow for a more nuanced, individualistic view of this issue?
We got 2 hours deep. I think this is a
Yes.
pretty good one. I kind of want to close by asking you a question. I'm going to really quickly cover one more of these comments here. Someone was bringing up Columbus Day and saying things about Columbus Day. It's interesting because Columbus Day has existed long before Columbus. Apparently, it goes back to 539 BC when it was celebrated, the Cyrus Cylinder Day, right? So this is the day of the first Declaration of Human Rights, and it's been going on ever since. We just simply replaced one name with another name over a period of time, and I think it's fine if we want to have a Columbus Day, but I think people should be more aware of the lineage of that holiday and how far it goes back to the Declaration of individual rights for individuals. I think it's actually a better source for that day. You can use it however you like, 539 BC. However, we could talk about USA. We could talk about the financing of left and right wing politics. We could talk about Zizek's book on Christian atheism and why he says it's interesting that talking to Christians can have more nuance because they're open to symbology and abstraction of thought that might make them a more interesting conversation than people who were taught to oppose all ideas of spirituality or metaphysics. I think it's worth looking at all of that. But the main thing I think that we should be saying as we leave is, how can we have conversations? How can we foster a culture where people with completely different opinions and ideas, right? Like we're showing you here, we can get something out of it where it's a constructive steelman, where I learned something from even the most crazy or the most completely oppositional ways of thinking, people that are illogical to me, and it doesn't devolve into threats of violence, right? And I wonder what you think about that. How can we do that?
I think through practice, through continual engagement, even when it seems difficult, and through creating opportunities for it, like the show that you have, or our US Transhumanist Party virtual enlightenment salons, or other shows on YouTube, also in-person discussion spaces. Is there a way to essentially replicate these kinds of spaces within a local community so that people in that community could come together and discuss issues in an environment that is going to be low penalty, maybe not free of all consequences, but free of people having to worry about losing everything if they say the quote wrong thing. So I think we need for each person to think about how to, in the words of Utah Governor Spencer Cox, disagree better. I think he's right on point with that. And to those who haven't heard his remarks in the wake of the Charlie Kirk assassination, I would encourage you to listen to those as well. So I would say this, per Charlie's own terminology, could be a turning point. It could be a turning point for the better or for the worse. And it is up to us to make it a turning point for the better, but it's also up to us to create structures within society that de-radicalize people and that lead more and more people to feel like they have options, that they have alternatives to violence, whatever those may be. And again, they may differ by personality. So some people will feel that a conversation is their option, or a debate is their option, or some form of peaceful activism is their option. Other people might feel like becoming completely apolitical is their option. So some people might decide, well, politics isn't really something I care as much about as I thought, because these other people whom I was previously taught to demonize aren't actually that bad. So it might not matter to me what the consequences of interactions in the political sphere are. I am not of that mindset myself. I tend to think that even if you don't take an interest in politics, politics will take an interest in you. But if other people are of a mindset to be less political, less politically engaged, that's okay, as long as they can treat people with respect, as long as they have something constructive to offer in whatever dimensions of life they seek to focus on, that's fine. But we need to create norms, institutions, and expectations and options for social peace. That's how we achieve a turning point for the better.
100% agree. I want to make sure everyone knows that they can get all sorts of conversations from Gennady. He does a series every week on his YouTube channel, and you can find it in the links I'll put in the description here for Gennady Stolyarov II. He does a live USTP salon where there are all sorts of amazing intellectual people, including one of my favorite people who's in the audience right now, Daniel Tweet. We'll definitely have to do a show soon. You suggested that we do a salon, and I would love to set one up. Let's definitely do one in the future. But in the meantime, you can definitely watch tons of amazing episodes. Every week, he has an incredible guest, usually several, and covers some of the best topics that you can find. Zoltan returned. That was an interesting one. John Carrott's conversation, the tribute, that was also really good. I would just say, if you're interested in Gennady, you should watch every episode. And in fact, make sure you're subscribed and have the bell rung so you can listen to all of the different USTP salons, and know that you can go to transhumanistparty.org, where you can find out more about the United States Transhumanist Party, which is probably not what you thought it was. I think that's a big thing. A lot of people misunderstand what it's about. And really, I would say this is one of my favorite things that's ever existed. Gennady's really done an incredible job bringing together and working with and commanding and chairing a group that has all sorts of different ideas spread out across not just the party or the platform or the universe, but are focused on a similar goal, which is giving every individual human the chance to fully realize their dreams and potential, which is pretty much what America was supposed to be about and what the world should really foster. So make sure you're tuned in to the Transhumanist Party and watching Gennady Salons. And yeah, thank you for being here, man.
Yes, thank you very much, Andreas. I'm honored by those words of high praise, and hopefully through this discussion, more people understand the nuances of what transhumanism is about, what transhumanists stand for. And really, I do echo the invitation for more people to get involved. We believe that we should all live long and prosper.
Excellent. And Scarlett, as a closing thought, says, we're all on the road to coexistence, and I totally agree. And she says, remember, guys, transhumanism is the future. I would agree. Transhumanism is the future, but I would nuance it by saying it's also the freaking present. So live for today. Thank you for being here. We'll see you again soon.
This next story has been suppressed by mainstream media. Let's go to Andreas for more.
Everybody, tune in to Recent Tartarians.
Recent Tartarians. Recent Tartarians.
Hello. Welcome to the Xirtus. Tune in for another exciting episode of wonder, imagination, and discovery.
Recent Tartarians.
Она образует всеобщие закономерности, определяющие законы классической физики для нашего
Sometimes I
мира.
look at the moon and just think, your skin's beautiful.
Baby, when I met you, there was peace unknown.
Что касается энергии наномер, то она превышает ядерную в немыслимое число раз. 10 в 74 степени.
That's it. That's it. That's it. With your arms now. That's it. That's it.
Thank you for watching Xirtus. Keep listening. Remember, if you enjoyed the video, please follow and subscribe and share and support. It really helps. Coming up next, Xirtus.
By the way, that's gone. If you didn't record that, that's gone forever. It's gone.